Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Overgaden, thank you to Alexander and everyone to invite us. We're very happy to be here, and I think we have heard so many ideas from the previous speakers, and it resonates absolutely. And we hope for a vivid discussion later on with all of us. And we take turns two times in this talk, about 25 minutes, we hope. I just wanted to say we read the talk to stay in the time limit, and it's rather theoretical, although we also bring artistic examples of the thought, how is it possible to see Central Anthropocene in the arts and science, so really like thinking about how bringing arts and science together. We will have examples like Anna Dumitriou, Sasha Spatschal, Mirjam Schwagel, and Honf come back to Indonesia, and have some proposals for science and methods and new thinkings, and reflecting theoretically about the position of artistic practice in the 21st century. Well, I can change images.
So, from the time of Darwin and Wallace until the second half of the 20th century, the story biology was one of specialists. Natural History Museum collections are filled with rooms of specialist study. It's interesting, in 1960, a 22-year-old graduate student at Berkeley, Lynn Sagan, and we know her now as Lynn Margulis, noted that there was no relationship between the members of the Department of Paleontology, where evolution was studied, and the Department of Genetics, where evolution was barely mentioned. Each department seemed oblivious of people and subject matter beyond its borders. Nearly all the bacterial geneticists began their careers as chemists. Margulies' unorthodox view of evolution and biology would radically change that. Her studies into horizontal gene transfer, especially among bacteria, archaea, and single-celled eukaryotes, would not only challenge orthodox and neo-Darwinian thought, but along with the advances in molecular biology that would prove her right, her theories would change biology and pave the way for much of biotechnology today, from recombinant DNA to CRISPR-Cas, both of which are really basically horizontal gene transfer done in the laboratory. Of course, like Margulies' four-part story of prokaryote and eukaryote symbiosis, in which four different cellular symbioses give rise to protists, and then animals, fungi, and finally plants. The emergence of 21st century biotechnology is also one of epistemological comminglings and symbiogenesis, or as Haraway would say, riffing on Margulies, sympoiesis. The incorporation of digital technologies into the lab, as well as new hardware, has opened up biology to the possibilities and benefits of cross-disciplinary exchange. In the last quarter century, we've seen a revolution in inter- and cross-disciplinary practice. Long past is the age of C.P. Snow's two cultures, one of science and one of the arts. Interesting to note that the essay was written a year before Margulies entered Berkeley. But how did artists get into the laboratory? First, there were two programs. MIT, where Joe Davis was the first artist to manipulate bacterial DNA. In 1986, he collaborated with the geneticist Dan Boyd to encode a symbol for the life and femininity into E. coli bacterium, a work called Microvenus. And then in the University of Western Australia in Perth, the Symbiotica project, which is literally an arts project embedded into the anatomy department, led by Oren Katz and Yunad Zor, along with Guy Ben-Ari, who we see here, biologist Miranda Grounds, and neuroscientist Stuart Bunt. Since 2000, students and artist residents have actually worked in laboratories alongside scientists and technicians. But equipment that in 2000 costs hundreds of thousands of dollars are today available for a few thousand, and over the last 10 years, artists and scientists and enthusiasts have created DIY labs. And we've come a long way since, even in the last 6 or 7 years, since Paul Vanus's performance Campfire PCR machine in Banff, where he creates this machine mechanism for multiple reproduction of billions of DNA fragments that's usually in a was once a very expensive laboratory piece, but could theoretically be done at a campfire. Today, we see in parallel growing numbers of artists in residence in biology labs and a thriving DIY scene, with projects in labs from BioCurious in the Bay Area to GenSpace in Brooklyn, Orca Pellitsa in Ljubljana, the Vag Society in Amsterdam, or Biologiegaragen here in Copenhagen. For further research, we recommend a rather ungainly, even chaotic website for an international organization called Hacketeria, founded by British artist Andy Gracie, an Indian sound and hybrid artist Yasha Shetty, and a kind of Swiss jack-of-all-trades, biologist, nanotechnologist, and biohacker Marc Dusselier. We'll return to Hacketeria later in our talk, but first let's look at 3 short examples of artist-scientist collaborations.
Well, Anna Dumitriou and modernizing medical microbiology. Is that loud enough? Yeah. I knew it would happen. Modernizing Medical Microbiology is a research group aiming to transform how to analyze and treat infections to improve patient care. One of their specialties is bacterial infections that are antibiotic resistant. One of the biggest challenges facing our species over the next few decades. We were hearing earlier about that already. Dumitriou was brought in as communication person. The idea being an artist could communicate ideas to hospital personnel and the general public, but got to use labs. And her enthusiasm and personality became key, not only to enabling access, but has influenced the biologists she has worked with. John Paul presents his paper, and that is a scientist, a microbiologist she was working with. He presents his paper within the panel I call Confronting the Bacterial Sublime, the Whole Genome Sequencing, Microbiology and BioArt, in an international conference called Metamorphosis in Prague in 2012. And I quote John Paul, "The whole process is fraught with difficulty and uncertainty, and even the scientists themselves have trouble getting their head around some of these concepts, so any other way of looking at it helps." Just this little quote should actually, it might convince us that there is an inspirational power coming from the arts towards the scientists, and they really take it seriously. In the talk, Dr. Paul goes over the natural history of bacteria and the medical history of bacterial research under the rubric of the sublime, noting that it was Anna Dumitriou who introduced Paul to the concept and aesthetics of the sublime. Allowing the specialist to step back and to see complicated work, often processes that have reached a dead end, from a wider or different perspective, plays an important role in research. Dumitriou is well known for creating the VRSA dress and the MRSA quilt, which were made from so-called superbugs. To create those works, she grew bacteria onto textiles and used natural and clinical antibiotics to create patterns, sterilized prior to exhibition. Bacteria have intricate communication capabilities. We have heard earlier about that and probably discuss more about it later on. Bacteria have intricate communication capabilities which are now being investigated as form of social intelligence. To explore this, the communicating bacteria dress combines bioart, historical textile techniques, such as whitework embroidery and 3D mapped video projections. The work was created by staining textiles using pigmented bacteria change when they send and receive communication signals. What the communicating bacteria dress shows us is bacterial communication within colonies, something called quorum sensing. Bacteria living in colonies and biofilms communicate via chemical signals dealing with threats or changes of the environment. Here the bacteria were genetically altered so that they would produce a violet pigment during the process. Demetrio placed an Edwardian dress in a giant petri dish with agar for this process. After the process was done, Anna discovered that the pigments would fade, so she filmed the process. She then projected the documentation on the still slightly stained dress so we can see what is a bacterial performance. Talking about another case, we call it the case Dr. Simon Park of the University of Surrey as a microbiologist. Already interested in visualizing his work as a biologist and professor for microbiology, his interaction with Anna Demetrio and other artists like Heather Barnett or Sarah Krask have led to a number of artistic projects making paper from bacterial cellulose and bacterial ink to produce an edition of Darwin's Origin of Species. These phone prints, or here, something completely different, also not so much considered as an artwork, but it's probably meandering as we see, is these phone prints actually an exercise which he do with his first year microbiology students. Amazing blog exists as well that you can see here or photograph. Just a mobile phone put into the agar. Talking about bacteria. Coming to artists that we have shown last year in our exhibition on the microbiome, actually, again resonating your idea and the gut and science and art, we would like to show you an amazing artist collective, Sascha Spatschal, actually coming from the arts, and Miriam Schwagel, coming from fungi microbiology, and Anil Podgorny coming from soft and hardware. Sascha is a post-media artist working at the intersection of living systems and research, contemporary and sound art. Her work focuses on a post-human environment in which humans exist and function as one of the elements in an ecosystem, not as a sovereign. Dr. Miriam Schwagel obtained a PhD in biomedicine from the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Ljubljana. As a scientist, he works in research and development in the field of applied biochemistry and biotechnology, with a specialty in the medical properties of fungi, or as some people say, fungi. Together with Anil Podgornik, a designer, they have produced several works dealing with symbiosis. Symbiosis, here in the form of a human microbiome. In their installation, Microphone Unison, and you see the word microphone is playing with myco, fungi. The artist-scientist-designer collective has developed a sound map of interaction between their microbiomes and the recipient. By leaving a fingerprint, the viewer sends a signal to the map that processes through the central celestial plate to the microbiomes. The polymodal sonification stresses the multiplicities of the makers. The 3 petri dishes, see here, on the celestial plate are cultured with samples from the work's 3 creators. These cultures in their multiplicity and complexity defy any monolithic or unitary definition of being. But in their ever-changing resistance to an electrical current, these cultures' microbiomes create together a unison of tone with the participatory of the visitor. So by pressing, the electrical circle is closed and the plate turns, and we didn't bring the sound, but there would be sound going on, the plate would move around, and the sound would change in the course of the 8 weeks of the exhibition, because the microbiome changes in the 3 petri dishes. Currently at Art Laboratory Berlin, we are showing the installation MyConnect. It's in an exhibition called Non-Human Networks, and we have information later on if you're interested. In MyConnect, and there's again the wordplay with myco, fungi, the nervous system of a person and fungal mycelium are plugged into a biofeedback loop. By entering the capsule, a person is equipped with a heartbeat sensor, headphones, and vibrational motors that are placed on various parts of the body. The heartbeat of a person sets the system in motion. The signal travels through the mycelium, where it is modulated in real time. The modulated signal is transferred back to the human body via sound, light, and tactile sensory impulses. The overwhelming stimuli that affect the nervous system cause an alteration of the heartbeat. A new loop begins, the circle is closed. A symbiosis of signal begins. MyConnect is a symbiotic interspecies connector that questions the anthropocentric nature-human division. With its circuit of signals and impulses generated and translated by biological technological organisms, MyConnect performs an immersive experience of symbiotic interdependence. Through this experience, the technological nature-human distinction can be seen as an arbitrary definition that serves particular biopolitical interests in human society.
Okay, our third example takes us to Yogyakarta, Indonesia, several artist collectives, and a microbiology professor. It's interesting to note here that the development of scientific knowledge has been dominated by North America and Europe, but we're now entering a phase where not only are Asia and Latin America and Africa producing much in the way of new scholarship, but also how science is being used to deal with a myriad of problems that await our species, from rising temperatures and water levels to degrading soils, the globalization of diseases like the West Nile or Zika viri, or antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. All these are questions that are already being answered in practice in the so-called Global South in surprisingly creative ways. So Professor Irfan Dwija Prijambada, professor of environmental biotechnology at the Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, and his work with local biohacking or bioart communities serve us as an interesting example. HANF, House of Natural Fiber, and Life Patch have achieved growing attention here in Europe over the past 5 or so years, winning the Transmediale Prize in 2011 and various awards and mentions at Ars Electronica. Both collectives and members come from various fields, from the arts and design, software, engineering, biotechnology. In 2010, Julian Abraham, August Tri Budiarto, and Nur Akbar Arafotala initiated a project of making safe and generic fermentation method to produce wine from tropical fruits. The project name was Intelligent Bacteria Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The project was a collaboration between art and science in the medium of biotechnology, where the purpose of the project was to dig in the local potentials of tropical fruits in Indonesia, create a safe and generic fermentation method, and distribute it to the society. The initiative itself was an artist-independent project and was supported with the collaboration of Irfan Dwija Prijambada and Doni Widianto from the microbiology department of the agricultural faculty of Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta. I'm actually quoting from Andreas Siagan's blog on this project. And note here that Andreas and the 3 other members who are in this photo were at a year after this, they left HANF, and with the exception of Julian, they created Life Patch, which is another collective in Yogyakarta. But the work here is interesting. It addresses alcohol poisoning, which is a common problem in rural Java. And basically what the artwork is, I mean, this is for exhibition, but there was an easier version. It provides a sonification of the fermentation process where people can literally hear if the fermentation process has gone wrong. It's also interesting to note that not only in urban areas, but even in rural areas, there's a fascination with experimental noise music in Indonesia that's growing. So the idea was maybe to use that hype when people in villages or in cities even would be making their own home brew they could play around with it and hear whether they were going to had poisoned them or would poison themselves, or whether it was good to drink. But several interesting phenomena here. One is this multidisciplinary collective and working across disciplines. And the second one is to produce a work that seems to solve a local problem. Art, in a way, is a side effect or perhaps a phase in a process, a creative process of problem solving. I also want to mention that emphasize the local aspect instead of maybe a more tendency in Europe or North America for artists to produce like grand global gestures instead of dealing with the local. Another example of this would be by some of the remaining members of HANF, the XX lab, and the project is called Sojakultur. It's an experiment with finding a solution for the wastewater product that's produced in tofu production. Tofu, along with tempeh, its fermented form, is a major part of the Javanese diet. By adding cetobacter to the wastewater, which would otherwise be thrown into the local river, the Sojakultur group produced cellulose. Through evaporation, the water would dry and we have this kind of cellulose material. They then sought to use this as a textile or craft material. The idea being to create a local industry where people would actually go and acquire this waste product, produce cellulose, and then market it as a finished product. It's important to note here that Jogja is a textile center as well, important part of its cultural tradition and current economy. Both of these projects were done in connection with Prijambada, and it's important or interesting that in a talk with the Javanese curator Grace Sambo, she mentioned several interesting results of the relationship between Professor Irfan Dwija Prijambada and these artistic communities. One was that Prijambada's biotechnology students are now given a task to produce bioart as part of their course plan to open up a creative potential in them as scientists. And the second one is that he encourages his students after graduation to create local startups, to use microbiology to solve local problems. And while some students might go on to study or work elsewhere in Asia, and it's interesting to note he himself studied in Japan, as I think Nur Akbar Arofatala from Lifepatch is currently doing his PhD in Japan. But most of the students will remain in Java and graduate into an environment where there really aren't, a lot of companies with microbiology jobs or biotechnology jobs willing to hire them. So this is also kind of solving what they do after college, but the idea is to bring it back to solving local problems, water quality, soil quality, and so on. Finally, we'd like to tie together Lifepatch, Grace, and Hakteria by recommending an amazing film, Seni Gotong Royong, Hakteria Lab 2014, Yogyakarta, and we'll play a bit of an interview with Grace Sambo and Professor Irfan Dwija Prijambada.
Juga isu yang dikenal sama publik seni adalah soal kerjasama gitu. Kolaborasi di dalam konteks seni itu selalu punya beban kayak satu pihak itu sebenarnya menggunakan pihak yang lain. Biasanya itu seniman bekerja sama dengan seniman gitu. Tapi belakangan dia berkembang jadi seniman bekerja dengan misalnya dokter atau bekerja sama-sama saintis atau sama apalah.
Memang dari sisi langsung gitu ya, itu lama dulu nggak ada dampaknya apa. Tapi kemudian kreativitas itu terus terbuka terus. Banyak seniman-seniman yang tidak kalah kreatifnya dibanding saintis untuk suatu perangkat lunak. Nah, biasanya perangkat lunak ini kan yang sulit kami dapatkan. Nah, banyak seniman. Terus saya waktu menjelaskan, contohnya saja, ketika saya itu menjelaskan tentang bagaimana terbentuknya koloni kok bener, padahal saya itu membelah ke samping. Nah, ada satu seniman, apa itu namanya itu, Tokar, menceritakan apa itu pendekatannya adalah menggunakan apa itu dulu namanya fraktal. Nah, itu seniman yang memulainya. Terus cerita dia fraktal. Oh iya betul, terbentuk. Kalau didetailkan untuk seperti ini. Nah ini kan menambah wawasan saya tentang ilmu saya sendiri. Nah kemudian ya dari guyonan seperti itu muncul misalnya si Mark datang cerita tentang bagaimana memanfaatkan kamera namanya kamera webcam berubah menjadi bisa kita gunakan untuk menjadi mikroskop. Nah seperti ini kan sangat bermanfaat untuk saya sehingga saya sangat nyaman.
Kerjasama tuh punya
Okay. So what is the potential of art and science collaborations in an age of, well, at least from our fast cultural perspective, slow motion disaster, also known as the Anthropocene? We would propose that for science, the arts not only offer communication or public outreach potential, but also have a potential for new ways of thinking about and dealing with processes. The arts do offer an interdisciplinary bridge also to the humanities, important today in convincing society stakeholders, politicians, the media, which problems to take seriously and how to deal with them. We're also increasingly interested with the idea of the artist as bioethicist, a position often taken up by philosophers, but we suggest that hybrid artists, schooled in philosophy and media theory, as well as arts, can offer an interesting alternative, especially when they have both the practical knowledge and experience in science. And this last part is important. There's plenty of art that approaches science from decades-old positions of conceptual art or postmodern theory. There's also plenty of what has become known as speculative design or critical design that uses science as a subject matter. But we insist here that art produced with an in-depth knowledge of the life sciences, but most importantly with lab practice, goes several steps further than previous conceptualisms with an interest in science. Addressing the crises of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, or as Haraway calls it, the Cthulhucene, is a unique responsibility for 21st century artists, one that suggests new forms of media, new processes, and new alliances, away from neoliberalism's appropriation of postmodern art. Finally, this is an art that we think can affect how our century develops and how we meet the striking challenges that are already happening.
Mm-hmm.